Hi, everyone. Welcome to the December 17th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona, and I'll be joined in just a second by my co-host, Craig Milkowski. On the podcast this week, we're going to take a look back at last weekend's stakes racing, primarily the graded stakes racing that took place at Gulfstream Park. That's where most of the top horses were in action, and we'll focus most of the show on what happened there. We'll also touch upon some racing from around the country, though, some stakes at Remington, Fairgrounds, maiden race at Los Alamitos, and a stakes race at Woodbine up north. Craig, how's it going? And what'd you think of some of the stakes action we saw last week? It's kind of one of these quiet weeks, I think, in the wintertime.
Yeah, it was good. It was the last hurrah for racing here in my hometown in Oklahoma City. So it was a little bittersweet, but it was a good day. I thought the racing around the country, it was just okay. It was about what you expect for this time of year. And, we're going to be slow till after Christmas and then fires back up with Malibu Day.
Yep, and that's actually just a few weeks away, as it seems like the year is coming to a close pretty quickly. Let's jump right in, though, and talk about some of that graded stakes action at Gulfstream Park. Let's begin on the turf with the Grade 2 Fort Lauderdale. I believe this was the highest rated race that was run last weekend from a graded stakes perspective, going the mile and an eighth on that Gulfstream Park turf course. And we talked about it in the TimeformUS forecast last week that this was a pretty wide open race heading in. You could make a case for a lot of the contenders, and no major surprise. Chad Brown gets the victory, though maybe with his less heralded runner Instilled Regard, although I think both of his horses were about the same price in this race.
Yeah, they wound up pretty close. Instilled Regard took a pretty big hit late, which was predictable if you were tracking the Will Pays from the other pools. He ran a good race. It's kind of a good story with Instilled Regard. He ran, I think it was fourth in the Kentucky Derby to Justify, transferred to the Brown at Chad Barn. And to be kind, it had been a bit of a struggle. He hadn't won a race in several attempts, but he ran well. He hasn't been running poorly. He had some rough trips. He, had some circumstances that didn't work out in his favor, but they all did on Saturday. And he got a 119 TimeformUS speed figure, which is the best he ever run on turf. He ever run some pretty fast races as a 3-year-old on dirt. But, I thought it was good. It was a good pick by you on the forecast and solid effort. Nothing. It's below par for a grade 2. Not going to try to sugarcoat it, but that's generally what you're going to get in December.
Yeah, I thought this was a race where trips really made the difference. Instilled Regard only won by a half a length, and I would imagine some others had a half a length of trouble or a half a length of ground loss where the result could have been different if the trips had worked out another way. I thought Irad Ortiz gave this horse a perfect ride. We had talked about it on the forecast last week, how the pace projector can be somewhat unreliable in these turf races, but I think in this situation, we probably shouldn't have taken it so lightly because it really turned out to be correct. Instilled Regard was forwardly placed, and we had talked about Channel Cap being a horse that was surprisingly far back in the pace projector because he had been forwardly placed in a lot of races going longer and had come from behind in a lot of his prior races going shorter distances. And the pace projector was actually right about Channel Cap because he was at the back of the pack in the early going, and I don't think that worked out too well, although he did finish third in this race as the favorite. Maybe the horse that was most unlucky of all was Flavius because he was sort of wide throughout. He tried to make a 4-wide move on the far turn without cover. Those moves rarely work out, especially when you're in a race where a horse with similar ability is saving ground inside. So perhaps he could have been the winner with a different trip. Admission Office also ran well, but we talked about him multiple times before. He's just a horse that seems to pick up pieces and not get the job done.
Yeah, in the pace, we don't have it coded in blue as being slow or anything, but it was certainly moderate. You can see by the flow of the figures, they increase as the race goes on, and that always makes it tougher for the come-from-behind horses.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Let's move on to the Grade 3 Harlan's Holiday, the race that took place after the Fort Lauderdale, going the mile and a 16th with the short stretch run at Gulfstream Park for the older horses. This is a hard race to really analyze because it was dominated by long shots. Obviously, there was an incident early in the race that kind of marred this race where Prince Lucky I believe he fractured a couple of sesamoids, and I haven't seen an update. I believe they're going to perform surgery this week. He got into an early duel with Bodie Express, and I think the fact that those two ran off in the early going kind of hindered Bodie Express's chances. Not that the pace was particularly fast, because I don't see that any of the pace figures are color-coded red for this race, but the race did go to horses that came from a bit off the pace, and War Story, who looked like he had lost a step in recent races, I believe he's 8 years old now, got the job done again. You have to admire this horse's longevity. He just seems to keep performing regardless of the barns he's in, regardless of the distance of the race. A cool horse, but not the best race.
No, it wasn't. Just to update, I did read this morning Prince Lucky did undergo surgery and it went well. He's resting and they're hopeful. We'll see. Fingers crossed that turns out well. War Story, he got a 114, which is really weak for older males in a grade 3, so I'm not going to be too excited about this one. Bodie Express, yeah, he did duel a little bit, but the fractions weren't particularly quick, and he wasn't that fast coming in, to be honest, especially around 2 turns. Maybe this is a horse who would be better off sprinting. I know that's hard to say for a horse who ran second in the Florida Derby, but that was just a crazy slow pace that day and probably aided him, and he did run a big figure sprinting in his debut. So I just don't think this horse is as good as the reputation. I kind of expected him to go off the favorite, and he did, but didn't like him a bit at all in here. And, you know, the others, they're just older at best grade 3 types. I just think they caught a weak field here. They're probably not even that good.
Yeah, this race is supposed to be a prep for the Pegasus World Cup, and I kind of doubt it's going to produce any serious starters for that race because they'd all have to run significantly faster to beat some of the top handicap horses that are out there. So I'm not really looking at this race as being a consequential one moving forward. And I agree about Bodie Express. I'd like to see him turn back to shorter races because he did show some high speed early in his career. Let's move on to a different dirt race at Gulfstream Park. Earlier in the day, they ran the Grade 3 Rampart, going the one-turn mile for the fillies and mares. And Pink Sands made a big run from the back of the pack. I thought Jose Ortiz gave this filly the kind of ride that she really needs. Took her well back in the early going, just launched that one run, and he was able to time it perfectly. He had to lose a little bit of ground on the far turn, but that's what you have to do when you're riding a closer. And she was just able to nail Cookie Dough on the wire. Nothing against Cookie Dough. She really probably ran the best race because she fended off all the early speeds. Just couldn't quite fend off the last run of Pink Sands.
Yeah, this was another good pick by you. Again, not to be Debbie Downer, but this was a really weak race for a grade 3. The winner got a 105 TimeformUS speed figure. Cookie Dough got a 107 running second, which I think is borne out by the trips. You know, not a whole lot to say about it. Like I keep saying, it's December. You're not going to get the best fields. A lot of barns are resting this time of year, looking for bigger spots. So, you know, just another one I'm not going to get excited about. Luckily, the next one we talk about is going to be a good figure. But this one, it looked weak coming in, and it's weak going out.
Yeah, I do just want to mention, because we talked about it on the forecast last week, credit to your very accurate speed figures at Gulfstream Park West this past weekend, because I had mentioned both Bodie Express and Baccarat Fashion, who looked like standouts on some other speed figures. You had just running ordinary figures in their last races coming into these spots, and they really ran back to their previous TimeformUS speed figures and didn't take any kind of step forward. So I think those numbers were right in line with where you had them. So good job there. And I just mentioned about Pink Sands, typical Shug McGahee kind of filly, just hitting her best stride now that she's almost turning 5 years old. It's taken a while to get there, but we sometimes see this with these Shug runners. I don't think she's any kind of, grade 2, grade 1 kind of filly moving forward, but she is in the best form of her career right now.
Yeah, I do think she relishes that one turn too.
I would agree with that. And a little bit of pace always helps horses like this, and she got that on Saturday. We also saw a ton of pace in the race that was 2 prior to this, the Grade 3 Sugar Swirl. Same division, just going a shorter distance, the 6 furlongs. And the pace projector told the story with this race going in that there was a ton of speed signed on, and it's always a possibility that one horse will get loose in these situations, and that could work against the others if there's not a real true closer in the race. And that's exactly what happened, because one horse did get loose. That horse is Ladies Island, and she just ran them off their feet. You could tell about the 3/8 pole she was not going to lose because nobody was running on from the back of the pack, and she had just opened up an insurmountable advantage, and didn't really matter what happened in the final quarter mile because she just coasted home.
Yeah, she was really impressive on Saturday. Like I said, this was no stealing of the race. All our fractions are in red as predicted. And we both kind of mentioned this on the forecast, that there were no real closers in the race. You kind of had to make a case to come up with one, and I couldn't do it. I wound up going with the wrong speed of the speed. But Ladies Island is a really promising filly. If you exclude the dirt races the turf races from her PPs, her speed figures have been good, and she even won on turf, albeit with a slower figure than she runs on dirt. But she's just been destroying her competition. She wins by open length. She's never really challenged early. So I'm not sure what the ceiling is with this one, but any race that she enters is going to be trouble for other front runners. And I'd really be curious. I don't know what the plan is with Kofefi, if she's coming back. And I don't know if this horse could keep up with her for a full race, but she would certainly give her a run for her money early.
Yeah, I do want to note this is a race that got a huge bump up off the final time speed figure. If you're seeing that this race has a big discrepancy between the buyer number and the TimeformUS speed figure, I think this is a good example of how the TimeformUS speed figure can really capture a performance like this and how well Ladies Island ran, because her final time speed figure was just a 115, but she gets a 9-point boost up to a 124 because of that very fast pace that she set in the early going. And she won this race by almost 7 lengths, but there's almost a 20-point gap back to the rest of the horses, because the ones that finished second, third, and fourth were just kind of picking up pieces late. So Ladies Island definitely ran that kind of race to earn that number due to the early fractions. And I mean, she's been kind of a rags to riches story, because they claimed her for $16,000, I think just over a year ago now. And now she's won, I believe, 8 of her last 9 starts. She's just in great form. She's been earning some big speed figures in the past, not quite this big, but doing it against weaker company. If she can do it against top company, she's going to be a force to be reckoned with. And I think one we'll hear from down the line. Let's move on to the turf and talk about the My Charmer. This was an ungraded stakes race, also for the fillies and mares. And we didn't handicap this one in the forecast last week because it featured a prohibitive favorite, and that favorite did get the job done, that being Mitchell Road. Perhaps had to work a little bit harder than some might have thought. She took a challenge at about the 3/16 pole, but she fended that horse off and just won pretty easily in the end. A horse that likes the one-turn mile distance, had some excuses against tougher company, and just appreciated the drop in class.
Yeah, I think it's pretty simple with Mitchell Road. When she makes the lead, she's tough. When she doesn't, she's usually not going to win. She's a solid grade 2, grade 3 type filly. She got a nice 118 TimeformUS speed figure for this win. I thought the runner-up ran pretty well. Luis Saez gave a heady ride to actually go up and press a horse who just looked like absolute lone speed, and held well to be second. But, Mitchell Road had this field over a barrel on paper, and it kind of played that way out on the track.
Yeah, when these turf courses get pretty firm at Gulfstream Park, and this one I see in the PPs is rated a 9 out of 10, it can be hard to make up a lot of ground from the back of the pack. And I think it was a good ride by Luis Saez on that long shot, take these chains to go after her, because she was able to hold on for second, even though she took that shot, because horses just couldn't make up a lot of ground from the back. Though Mitchell Road just better than these horses, and she'll probably be on to another graded stakes race in the future. I do want to get your take on a race from early in the day on Saturday, Gulfstream Park. I believe it was the second race of the day, going 6 furlongs for the 2-year-olds. We saw a first-time starter Untitled for Ralph Nix just basically run off the screen and earn a speed figure, I should say, that is going to put him in the conversation, I think, for the Triple Crown Trail. We'll see if he's the kind of horse that can stretch out, but what was your take on this debut?
This was a very difficult speed figure to make. I will be honest about it. I'm sure I coded it as such, probably with an F, because it was all first-time starters. There were only 2 6-furlong sprints on the day, this and the stakes race we talked about earlier. And there was literally nothing to go on with the second race. So I just kind of had to use the same variant from the stakes race and apply it to this one and go from there. That's always a bit dangerous, but I don't want to be the guy that just arbitrarily knocks a speed figure down for no other reason than I don't think it was possible the horses could have run that fast. The horse was certainly visually impressive, and it wouldn't shock anyone if he ran fast. So I'd say I'm not overly confident in the figure. It's certainly one I'll be tracking, but I think it was the right call to give it because I have nothing else to go on.
Yeah, and I would say I think it stands up to all of the preliminary tests you would do to make sure that a big speed figure doesn't look totally out of line before you see runbacks. Because, I mean, let's face it, this horse won by 11 lengths and beat the favorite, who was second. The distance from first to fourth was, I believe, 23 lengths. So, I mean, when you see there's just like gigantic gaps between the horses, that usually is a signal that the winner ran a pretty high speed figure. This was a race, I believe, for Florida breds. The winner is a son of new sire Kozan. Not a ton of pedigree on the dam side, especially not pedigree to suggest that this horse is going to want to go longer in the future, although I guess you could say that Kozan could eventually be a route influence. We'll see how that works out. Ralph Nix can get a debut horse ready, so we'll see if this one goes on. But, I mean, he's certainly run well enough to get through an allowance condition next time, because we haven't seen too many 2-year-olds out there running numbers like this so far.
No, he's certainly promising. And I mean, there were some also rans well back in the field who ran before. And it's not like I'm giving them the same speed figures they had run. They all took significant drops. So it's definitely one to play out. And, it's not a horse I'd want to bet against based on what I saw. So we'll just have to see on the number. And I'm sure it's one we'll talk about in future podcasts.
Yeah, sticking with the 2-year-olds, let's move on to Remington Park, where you were on Sunday. And I think this has been the theme with a lot of the 2-year-old races, stakes racing that we've talked about, that the speed figures just aren't that impressive. And I think that holds true here as Shoplifted gets the job done by a head over Answerin. The top 3 horses here all earned those 103 TimeformUS speed figures, which are just okay. Interesting flow to this race that I want to ask you about, though, because they really slowed down halfway through, and then they just kind of sprinted home and opened up a huge gap on the rest of the field.
Yeah, it was a little bit of an oddly run race. I'm going to have to go back and watch the races. We have it coded as favoring closers. Somewhat, it's in light blue, not that dark blue color. And just watching all the races, I got the impression that the rail probably wasn't the place to be. Most of the winners made sweeping moves on the outside, similar to what Shoplifted did. So maybe Answerin ran a little bit better than the number would look. He got that same 103, as you said. He kind of got steadied a little bit and had to duck down inside to get room and make his run through the lane, while Shoplifted was wide in the clear. But, on the other hand, Shoplifted lost at least a few more lengths than Answerin did. So it just kind of depends what you think on the rail. I don't have a firm opinion as of now. The races just happened Sunday. I'll go back and make my trip notes. But that was just a general impression I got watching, that you really didn't want to be speed on the rail on Sunday.
Yeah, it's actually something I was intending to ask you about, because I just watched these 2 races, the ones we're going to talk about, the Springboard Mile and the Jeffrey Hawk, which was the race that was run after this as the 13th on the card. And they both had significant outside flows to them, not necessarily favoring horses from way back, but just seemed like horses on the rail didn't do a whole lot of running. So I think that's an interesting perspective and something to take a look at if you're examining the entire card. Shoplifted ran fine. I would still maintain what I said before the race, that I don't think this horse wants to go much farther than a mile. He was even getting a little tired at the end of this race. It seemed like he had every right to go on and win by a length or 2, and just kind of couldn't really put away the others late. Answerin, I did think ran well, because he had to sort of wait behind horses as Shoplifted and Bolton made those first moves coming around the far turn, and then he had to duck down inside to rally late. He probably didn't deserve to be 3-5 in this race, which was kind of a ridiculous price on him given his PPs coming in. But he still has upside in just his 4th career start, rather. And I think he's one that can do better out of this. We'll see how strong this race ultimately proves to be, though.
Yeah, I agree. The one good sign for Answerin, he did break pretty well after having gait problems in his first couple tries. So if I had to pick one going forward, it would be him. But, I'm not all that optimistic. We kind of pointed out on Friday, Shoplifted had a speed figure right there with the rest of these horses after running last in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile. So that kind of tells you it was a big drop down in class, and these horses would have to improve it quite a bit to be serious 3-year-old contenders.
We did see a much faster race get run right after the Springboard Mile in the Jeffrey Hawk Memorial, as Sleepy Eyes Todd, who's kind of an interesting 3-year-old to take a look at, because if you haven't been aware of him yet, because he kind of ran a really big speed figure sort of out of nowhere in the Oklahoma Derby two back. It was his race right before this when he was second to Owendale. And I think it was really a question mark of whether he could run back to that figure or go back to his prior form in this subsequent race. And he ran back to that Oklahoma Derby performance, because I know he only won by half a length, but I thought he did it really well. And the horse he was holding off, Chris and Dave, he's a tough, hard knocker who can come up with a big speed figure every now and then.
Yeah, he is, and he had that nice outside flow that we were talking about, so I think he had a good trip. Sleepy Eyes Todd, he's a horse in the Oklahoma Derby, was 40-1, which was probably a bit he was probably a bit betting there just based on his past performances. He was a horse who had laid off since February, and then he came back at Canterbury and won an allowance race easily with a 109 TimeformUS speed figure. Then he won an off-the-turf allowance there, but he did it with a 117 speed figure. So the Oklahoma Derby race wasn't completely out of the blue. I mean, he ran a 122 that day, so it was a 5-point step up. But this one definitely validated that race. I thought he ran really well in here. He beat the venerable Shotgun Cowboy, who I think did hang on for third. He's getting losing a little bit of a step at 7 years of age, but still a really solid runner. He actually went off the second choice in here. He ran his typical 114, 115 type speed figures. So, this was no easy field for Sleepy Eyes Todd, and I was impressed, and I look forward to seeing how this horse does. I'm assuming he's going to wind up at Ocon and run into some stiffer competition, but he's a good colt, no doubt about it.
Yeah, it was funny to see the names of some of the also-rans in this race because Timeline, who used to be in Chad Brown's barn, was fourth here. Looking at Lee, who was once a runner-up in the Kentucky Derby, he was fifth here. Obviously, they're not quite the horses that they once were going back a number of seasons, but just interesting to see those classy horses' names in the running lines for this race. And I agree with you, Sleepy Eyes Todd, based on these last two performances, he's one that could be a factor in the handicap division because there are some horses that are retiring like Vino Rosso, and I think it's kind of open the same way that it was at this time last year. So if anybody can step up, it's certainly a horse that's earned a couple of these 120 plus TimeformUS speed figures. So he's one to watch over the winter. Let's move down to the fairgrounds, talk about stakes race they ran there on their Louisiana Champions Day. The classiest race that they ran was obviously the Ladies Sprint, where you had a couple of horses in there who had contested graded stakes this year, one of those being Minute to Stardom, who did get elevated to the victory in this spot. She was, I believe, the favorite coming into this race. There was a bumping incident, or a couple of bumping incidents in the stretch. She lost this race by 2 lengths, but the winner, Midnight Fantasy, was disqualified for that bumping in the lane. Minute to Stardom, just to start with her, she's a really nice horse. She's done very well since the trainer switch earlier this year, just losing once to Come Dancing, but she's won all of her other races, and she's can just earn those TimeformUS speed figures in sort of the 110 to 120 range, and that makes her good enough to win these state bred races, certainly.
Yeah, and she's certainly not your typical horse that just runs in state bred races. She can step into open company with these kind of speed figures and run well. She's done it already, as you mentioned. She shipped around. She ran well at Laurel. She ran well at Belmont. I don't think there's any doubt that DQ was warranted. I hadn't actually seen this race until this morning and went and watched the replay, and the bumping was pretty severe, especially the second one. So that 2-length gap might be a little bit deceiving. I think no matter who was adjudicating this race, there would have been a DQ. So that said, I don't want to take anything away from Midnight Fantasy either, despite her weaving through the lane. She certainly ran a fast race. She actually gets a little bit better TimeformUS speed figure. I don't think she ran a better race. I do think the favorite would have won without the bumping, but she ran well, probably her best race to date, and these kind of speed figures could be dangerous in open company.
Yeah, it's funny. I frankly don't know who would have won. I kind of was of the opinion that Midnight Fantasy was pulling away again before the bumping incident occurred. She was about 3/4 of a length in front of Minute to Stardom after they had gotten on even terms prior to that, when she came out badly, which I think was the incident that caused the disqualification. I don't know if Midnight Stardom was coming back at that point because she was already losing ground. I mean, but the bumping incident was severe, so I understand why they took this horse down. I'm not saying I disagree with it. I just think maybe it's a closer call than some people thought it was. But I think every jurisdiction is different about this, so I don't know what the rules really are like in Louisiana. But both of the top two ran well. Midnight Fantasy, just to give her a quick mention, I mean, she's a 3-year-old filly who's obviously improving now. She hadn't really run a speed figure like this before, but she can always, when you're a 3-year-old at the end of the year, you can always improve. And she took a nice step forward here for Joe Sharp and ran well. But these top two, they could go back into graded stakes company at some point because they're running those kind of speed figures. Let's move on to a maiden race on Sunday at the fairgrounds. And this is just a maiden for the 2-year-old Louisiana bred. So not a race that you expect to see a top horse exiting. But we did see a pretty special performance by No Parole, a first-time starter for Maggie Moss, the owner, and Tom Amos, the trainer. Not sure what this horse was beating, but anytime a maiden wins by 14 lengths in a special weight, I think you want to take notice. And you could talk a little bit about what speed figure this race might get. But No Parole, I mean, he was ridden out to the wire, but he just widened on this field with nice strides, was really coming home well through the final quarter mile. Looks like one that could be okay. We'll see.
Yeah, I don't do the speed figures for the fairgrounds. For the most part, my assistant does, but I did take a look at the sheet that we use, and I would project this horse is probably going to get about a 101 TimeformUS speed figure, so certainly nothing to sneeze at for a 2-year-old, especially a Louisiana bred. As we said, the Springboard Mile, which awarded Kentucky Derby points, the winner only got a 103, so certainly a promising debut. Anytime you win by that kind of margin in a maiden special weight, even for state bred, it's probably something you should take a second look at. And, it looks like this horse definitely has some talent. I don't know how far he wants to go. That's something I leave to the breeding guys like yourself. And we'll see where he shows up next.
Yeah, this is one that, I mean, I didn't look at what the final time speed figure was, but I would imagine it was one that got knocked down a little bit off the final time speed figure because they did really slow down to the half mile in this race. Actually, it's kind of funny if you look at the fractions. They ran the second quarter slower than they ran the final quarter, which I think speaks to the fact that this horse was just really flying through the lane when he came home in this race. But that's often going to result in a TimeformUS speed figure that features a blue color-coded pace figure. I don't know if that's the case, but I was certainly impressed by this horse. He's a son of violence. On the dam side, it's hard to tell at what distance he's ultimately going to be best at. He's obviously a proficient sprinter, so we'll see if they keep him doing that. Not saying this is a Triple Crown kind of horse, but just an exciting one to follow over the winter because this was certainly an auspicious debut.
Yeah, I pulled up the sheet that you mentioned. He's definitely got docked a few points because of the slower half mile. As you said, the opening quarter and the final time actually got the same figure. It was that half mile that dipped about 10 points. So just off the top of my head, he's probably going to get docked about 3 or 4 points off the final time. So that would be around a 105.
And that's one of those things you want to be aware of because when a horse is just a standout in a race and he's facing a field of runners that are inferior to him, he can get away with something like that and slow the race down midway and then speed up at the end. If he's going to face a more contested pace scenario next time, he might have to run a fast second quarter, and sometimes that's the undoing of these impressive debut winners. Not saying that's going to be the case with this horse, but I do think you want to be aware of that stuff. It's not like we're just being harsh on this horse and knocking down the speed figure because he didn't beat anything. It's because of the way that the race was run.
Yeah, it definitely is. And it actually, our figures get a lot of notoriety when they're read and horses get upgrades, but we do the downgrades, and I think they're just as effective in most cases.
And just to provide an example of that, I didn't send in this race because it didn't come up super fast, but we had talked about at Laurel a few weeks ago, an impressive debut winner, a 3-year-old named Benintendi for, I believe, Brittany Russell, who had a very similar race flow where he really slowed down midway and then sprinted through the lane. I think he also got a 101 TimeformUS speed figure, but it finished so impressively, looked like a horse that might be able to go on and win stakes in the future just due to the visual impression. Well, he came back as odds on in a non-100s of 1 allowance race at Laurel this week and got outrun to the front, couldn't keep up early and couldn't come from off the pace. So you want to be aware of that stuff if a horse has to adapt to a new situation second time out. It's not always as easy as it might seem. Let's move on to another maiden race with the 2-year-olds at Los Alamitos. This one's not a first-time starter, actually a second-time starter. On Saturday, I believe this is a 2-year-old filly. Speech made her second start for Mike McCarthy. She had debuted going 5 furlongs on the turf at Del Mar, but they switched to dirt second time out, going to 6 furlongs here. And she's obviously a dirt horse because she took a big step forward in this race and won impressively, drawing off by almost 10 lengths in the lane. Good visual impression with this horse, and the speed figure came back, pretty well for a maiden special weight winner.
Yeah, it did. She got a 105 here, which is obviously very solid. It's just based on some of the figures we talked about today already. It was a 108 final time, knocked down a little bit because of the pace. We do have the half mile and the quarter mile coded in blue as being slow. It was a promising looking race. My one reservation is that it was at Los Al. It is still, in my opinion, a very quirky track. Some horses like it, some don't. They don't always carry their form when they move on to Santa Anita or in the summer to Del Mar, but it doesn't mean they won't either. I mean, some do, some don't. So I'm willing to give this one the benefit of the doubt based on the visual. She looked like a future stakes filly, and hopefully they'll keep her on dirt because she certainly looked like a different filly on that surface.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. I looked up her pedigree to see what she ultimately might want to do, and she really does have a turf pedigree on the dam side. It's actually a New York bred family that I'm very familiar with, and they're all turf sprinters. I believe her dam is by Freud, but she's by Mr. Speaker, and we haven't seen a ton of the Mr. Speakers run, but the two best ones that I can think of off the top of my head, including this filly, were Speech and 3 Technique, who won so impressively over the summer for Jeremiah Engelhart, and they both seem to be dirt horses, so maybe Mr. Speaker's turning out to be a dirt sire. I think we've got to get more evidence of that, but that's something to keep an eye on. And this filly certainly took to the dirt and won impressively. So given what we've seen out in California and some of the speed figures that the horses in stakes have been earning, maybe she can make that transition to stakes company. We'll see where they target with her, but she's definitely one to keep an eye on. Let's wrap up the show with the longest race we're going to talk about on this podcast, the Valedictory up at Woodbine. This race goes at 1 3/4 miles in December every year on the synthetic track. And Pumpkin Rumble was able to repeat. He won this race last year, came back again and won even more impressively this year, perhaps, beating a large field this day, but just opened up on the far turn, had an insurmountable advantage at the quarter pole and coasted in for Eureka Rosa da Silva. This horse is an 8-year-old now and just seems to be in top form, loves these long distances.
Yeah, he does. I'm not sure if we're even going to do a speed figure for this race. My assistant does Woodbine. I left it up to him, and he hasn't gotten back to me yet. Just looking over our sheet, if I were going to give one, it would probably be around a 120, 121 range. I'm not sure how much utility that has till they come back next year and run this race again. That was one marathon card on closing day at Woodbine Sunday. I don't know that if I ever remember a card for thoroughbreds with 16 races like they had there. That was one serious long day. It seemed like it was never ending, but it was a strong card. I think, is he the rider who was retiring after this day, Eurico da Silva?
Yeah, I believe. I know they were saying on that this was his last stakes victory, so I would assume that was the case because he's a rider whose name I've been hearing forever, and cool to see a rider like that go out on a high note. Yeah,
that's what I was going to say. I'm almost positive it was him, and seemed like a great guy in the interview that I saw, and what a way to go out with an easy win. This horse was 3-5 for a reason in here. He loves the distance. He's proven he can win on that synthetic surface, so not a whole lot to take out of this one, but a good story on the rider.
Yeah, definitely. That's all the racing we're going to recap this week on the podcast. Craig and I still have to work out what our schedule is going to be over the next couple of weeks. I'm sure we'll announce that on Twitter with the podcast. Obviously, Christmas is coming up in about, I want to say 8 days now. Wow, it's really sneaking up on me. Got to do some holiday shopping that I'm behind on.
Amazon. Go Amazon.
Yeah, got to get on that maybe later today so I get things in time. But we'll see if we're going to do a forecast on Friday. It's something that we'll talk about and announce. There are some stakes races coming up this weekend. I believe in New York they're running the Queens County on Saturday and the Gravesend on Sunday. I'll see how those races come up. So we'll discuss if we're going to do a forecast, if there are enough stakes races to talk about, or a forecast on Friday. Obviously, though, I think we're going to skip the Pacecast and the forecast on Christmas week, those being the Christmas Eve and the 27th being right after Christmas. But we'll certainly be back after that. We'll be back in the new year talking about all that racing when Santa Anita picks up again. So look for a lot more content coming from us in the next few weeks, and we'll talk about whether or not we'll shoot that show on Friday. So Craig, good to talk about these races with you as always. You can listen to the TimeformUS Forecast and the TimeformUS Pacecast on DRF.com, Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, and SoundCloud. Wherever you go to your podcast, just subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel and check us out. Thanks for listening this week, and we'll come back at you pretty soon.